let's talk about there in the fourth memoir. It's more didactics in service to talking about how you became a great poet and all sorts of things. It's more writing centered in a lot of ways, and kind of summarizes the whole of the memoirs. But there is one in the early memoir where words strike. It's on page 82. That is a didactic and speaks about the difference between what you would have done now as a poet compared to what you would have done then.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time concedes that many of these poems that you're changing would be lessened in a way in their emotional weight should you change them for intellectual purposes.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that every artist have to do. I call it, I guess it's best to call it the W.H. Auden effect. W.H. Auden was a poet who wrote a handful of great poems. He's considered a great poet. He really wasn't, but he wrote a handful of great poems, a few other near great poems, and then he spent the last 25 or 30 years of his published or living of his life fucking up his earlier poems. Probably another good example is what's her name? The lady with the tricorn hat, Marianne Moore. She kept fucking with her poems too. It's like, what is with these people? Yes, I could probably have written the two poems there, War and the Runaway, better now if this was the first impulse to write about that. But you lose something of the rawness, and also it's important I think, to document the growth. I mean, for example, I have marble notebooks for every poem I ever wrote. I have listed, either written in a handwritten holograph or just what the poem was, because I think it's important to chart the growth of someone, so that if you were to feed, let's say in 50 or 100 years and I'm dead, and someone wanted to feed in all of my writing, and you could then poem by poem, writing piece by writing piece, feed it in, and maybe the computer could figure it out, the growth process of how I did this, that, or the other thing. Sure, Shaskia.
When we're speaking about this particular memoir, it's titled Where Words Strike.
Yeah.
There's also another point, and we were speaking earlier of Fellini's Intervista, and if you compare Intervista to La Dolce Vita, there's such a disparity between the two. It's almost as if he was working in a different art form. Plus, that Intervista would be more a Fellini ripoff than something conceived by Fellini. The thing noted here, and how many critics conflate with it, is they kind of become fans of these artists, and not just fans, but sycophants, and they will take any piece of art from that artist, regardless of how bad it is, and kind of group them in together. So Intervista gets grouped in with La Dolce Vita and 8.5, and there's no difference between it. The difference between how you view your art is quite interesting in that you compared The Runaway to a poem called War, which was one of your early great poems, and you said The Runaway is a 95 out of 100 and War is a 98 out of 100. And there is a greater difference between these two than, say, a 70 and an 85. And that's something that is rarely noted along in art, because there's this tendency to take a great artist and then just make everything of his or hers equal, rather than having a critical mind and discerning, even at the top of their abilities, where each one exists within their own universe. Because a poem like War is far more memorable in its use of the idea of war as a game and as an actual war than The Runaway, which is more elevated by its language than how War is deeper and gets into the mind of its characters far more effectively.
Well, yeah, and obviously there are poems and works of art. This is why I said, I know Jessica was telling me you asked her when you spoke with her last time, did she think that A Norwegian in the Family was the greatest book ever written? And when she's telling me that, she was sort of looking away and sort of smiling, because I remember, and you don't know Jessica as well as some of the other people on the E-list or whatnot, but Jessica, I told me that when she read A Norwegian in the Family, she was weeping at the end, but she wasn't weeping because of the ending of the book. She was weeping because she said it's so wrong and it's such a shame that such a titanic great work of art doesn't have a mass audience. And it's not that, and a Norwegian in the Family isn't a kind of work that this snooty kind of stuff that's you know try to be James Joyce and above it all. It's right there in your face. Anyone can understand it on one or two levels, even though it may work on several dozen levels. And uh, she said she was crying because she knew that at that moment she was the only person in the history of the world that, other than myself, who had read that. There was one guy in the E-list who had read it a few days before, but who had read it as well. But she was the only person engaging that right there, and she felt that was wrong. And you have to give things their due. You have to give people their due, art or otherwise. You know, there's this tendency to, for example, to in art especially, to say, well, this person had a good heart. They were trying to do something or whatnot, but that doesn't make it great. You can't get away with talking about this, that, and the other thing about and stuff outside of the art and bring it into the art. It doesn't matter, for example, that in the other sense that Rilke was a son of a bitch scumbag in his personal life. His great poems last beyond that, and they, if they don't totally exculpate him, they sort of obviate his personal bad stuff, because it doesn't really matter to us that he was bad to his wife or daughter or this, that, or the other thing. um you know and so that's the way I feel about it. You have to take these things and look at them as individual works of art.
But it's interesting in a memoir that you would include critical insight, because that's something that most memoirs, even de facto kind of memoirs like A Tree Goes in Brooklyn, they would never include something like that. They may be well rendered or even greatly rendered, but they don't include things that's kind of outside of the main narrative in such a way, or
Yeah.
something that would seem almost disjointed, like criticism in a facto tale about your childhood and whatnot. Then
Well,
there's also a few other memoirs that get into ideas of science, like propinquities and potencies, which get into the idea of Schrodinger's cat and the idea of physics on a whole, and then also connects it with some of your memories of dealing with kind of physical phenomenon.
yeah. Well, I, I, in the last couple of nights, I was just writing some notes for when we were talking, and I never used this term before, and it just came to me, and I'd call it critical paralysis, and I think if this was after doing the Fellini interview and speaking with so-called critics who really aren't critics but historians, and historian serves an important purpose, and they can sometimes do good DVD commentaries. But most people, in the face of great art that they haven't experienced before, blank out. They're like a kid that's been overwhelmed. It's like Alex in A Clockwork Orange with the eyes just overwhelmed. They are critically paralyzed because they view art as something beyond just a task. And yes, it is beyond just a simple task, but you can approach it as a task and break it down to a certain degree. This most manifests itself when a person is encountering a new work for the first time. You can show me any film. For example, when I watched The Thin Red Line, the film by Terrence Malick, the first time in '98, I watched it with this guy Dylan Wall and his then wife, and I knew within 5 minutes that this was likely going to be a great film if it held up. Dylan, however, he just didn't like the film, uh, and I argued with him about it, and I defeated most of his arguments, if not all of them. But most of these people, for example, you could get poetry critics. When I did the Hart Crane show, these guys were talking about what made Crane great. I'll guarantee you, though, if you put before them all of my Skyline poems, or poems totally uncraning like my Rosario poems, they would have a hell of a difficult time in describing why they work, why this Rosario poem is great, that one is just merely very good, and whatnot, because they need to have a syllabus put out before them. Most critics cannot nakedly go in and take something on and say definitively, yeah, this is great, and I'm going to tell you why. What they need to do is have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 people talk before them, and then what happens is you'll get some critic who, after 6 months of a film being out, or 3 years after a novel comes out, says, "Well, I always knew that so and so such novel was great because of this, that, or the other thing." But it's only because they've had it threshed out by other people, and they can see things that they themselves couldn't have gotten. But the 50 other critics may have come up with 12 or 13 nuggets of the greatness that this person then later comes and wraps a lasso around and makes a thesis of. The difference is, a great critic, I can do that all by myself at the first viewing. That's the difference, critically speaking, between me and other people. And I can apply that to myself because I can step away from myself. I can tell you, you know, if I opened up my old marble notebooks, the first poem I ever wrote in 1984, it actually wasn't the first poem. I actually wrote a couple of poems in the 70s that I'd forgotten about that I talk about in this memoir. But the first poem that I wrote when I said, I'm going to write poetry, was about this girl that I was trying to woo in high school. I won't use her real name, but I wrote, it was called A Chance, and it was just quatrains, and it was crap. But even amongst that 3 or 4 pages of quatrain crap, there were probably half a dozen to maybe a dozen turns of phrases that I could look and say, that person has it. Jessica often comes to me and says, I always say someone has potential, or someone. Well, there are lots of people that have potential. You asked me in the last time, to name poets who I thought had as much or more talent than I did. And there are people who never did anything that I could see little turns of phrases, and I could encourage people. But most people don't stick with it. Most people don't have that passion, and they don't want to do the hard work. It is hard fucking work. It is harder to write a great poem than it is to do a single day's work of physical labor. And I've done that. I've taken mauls, I've taken sledgehammers, and I've literally worked day labor jobs where I was literally breaking rocks like on a chain gang back when I was in my mid-20s. I did that here and there. I did a little bit to get the experience, a little bit just to have a little bit of money. But I've done heavy physical labor. To write a poem, to write a book like the Vincetti Brothers, that takes more effort than it would to take for an average person to work 10 years doing any job. I don't care what it was, in management, physical labor, whatever. That takes a more concerted effort. And one of the things I've gotten really mastered is concentration. I not only can distill words, but I can distill my concentration that everything else extraneous goes out. And I was talking about having a convective mind in one of the recent interviews I did, a convective memory. And I know when I get on that, it's just like when I read, and I'm reading a bad book and I can start reading paragraphs by myself. I can't do it. I can only do that. I can't do it consciously, but it happens unconsciously. In the same way, when I get on a roll and I'm writing a great poem, or I'm writing great words, I'm thinking great, my mind, my unconscious mind takes over. For example, if I was in a debate, for example, with Harold Bloom talking about poetry or anything, I would, after about 10 or 20 minutes, and if I went on a soliloquy, I would be like, if you mixed Oscar Wilde with Robin Williams, with George Carlin, with William F. Buckley and James Baldwin, I would be a combination of all of them. Things would be coming out of my mind so quickly. So I would be, Harold Bloom would be a bloody pulp on the floor. I would slice and dice him intellectually. He would be ashamed to show his face ever again. But that's one of the things. It's like drawing from the unconscious, reaching down. I've talked about how people, what I call the fallacy of divine inspiration, the divine inspiration fallacy. People think that it's all up there, and if you take something down, that's inspiration I can have. That's bullshit. It all comes from within you. I've done interviews recently about consciousness. I don't believe in this bullshit that I'm one of the fingers of consciousness that inhabits the universe. I am unique. I was born on February 2nd, 1965, conceived 9 months thereof before then. It's one random sperm meeting my birth mother's egg, and when I die, whether it's in 2030 or 2050 or after that, that'll be it. There'll be nothing like me ever that came before. Now, you can say that about anyone, but when you're talking about people who have done great things, whether it's in the arts, whether it's a Genghis Khan, whether it's a Joseph Stalin in a negative sense, these are the things that need to be studied. This is why great artists need to be studied, great leaders need to be studied, great scientists need to be studied, because only by studying them, and hopefully artificial intelligence helps discern the things that make artists great a bit more. Uh, because you need someone with a great mind like mine that didn't have the will to create, but had the will to just study and take that apart. If you have that in something like artificial intelligence, you will hopefully unleash some of these people who have that, what I said, have that little ability, that turns of phrases that I had in that very first poem. But why did they become an accountant? Why have they spent the last 25 years as an accountant with 3 kids and a mortgage while I became a great artist? No matter what personal issues I might have in my personal life about jobs I may have lost, or about personal issues with problems physically or whatnot, I became great at something. Another person didn't. And while in a sense there's not a huge difference at the beginning, there's a gaping chasm at the end. And that's the same difference between when we're talking about great poem versus a mediocre poem. The difference between a poem or any work of art that I'd rate a 75 or an 80, you say, oh, that's only 5% difference. No, it's not, because the difference between that is far more minuscule than the difference between, say, something that I would rank a 95 and a 96. The difference, in fact, between something that's barely passable at a 65 and something that's just gets over the hump to near greatness at a 90 isn't a 25% difference. That difference is not as great as the difference between a 94 and a 95 to get over the hump of greatness. And so the greatness is something that doesn't go on just an arithmetic level. It's geometric. It's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. Or sometimes it might even go 3 times 3. It's geometrically great by powers.
It is in a way randomness applied what greatness is, and it also has a pyramid effect where each a succeeding generation builds off the other person. It is interesting that you speak about potential, because there are likely many people, well, not many, but a small percentage of people who could be great artists or have the material or fodder that you did. There were many children who grew up in the environs that you did, but weren't able to use it because of lays, because of all assorted reasons that they themselves lacked. So what you have is natal, but there could have been a handful of others with similar backgrounds that were natal, but simply didn't apply the random spike in greatness.
Yeah, but the reality is 99.99% of them don't even have the talent to begin with. And so you're talking
Correct.
about a very, very
Yes.
small, fleeting
Very
margin
small.
at the cusp.